Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. We live in a remarkable moment in history. As we sit here in 2026, we are surrounded by a paradox that would have baffled our ancestors. We possess at our fingertips the most vast, intricate, and specialized apparatus for understanding the physical and social world that humanity has ever known. Our telescopes peer into the dawn of time. Our laboratories can edit the very code of life. Our algorithms can predict our behavior before we even feel the impulse to act. Yet, simultaneously, we find ourselves in a crisis of authority. Never has the possession of knowledge been so high, and never has the authority of those who possess it been so fiercely contested. We are witnessing what sociologists call a fundamental epistemic divide, a rupture in how we determine what is true and who has the right to say so. In the past, the sociology of knowledge was a quiet, niche subdiscipline. It was concerned with the social origins of ideologies, how a person's class or culture might color their worldview. But today, this field has moved to the very center of our political and cultural life. It is the lens through which we must view the rejection of climate science, the polarization of public health, and the rise of digital populism. At the heart of this struggle is a definitional war between two words we often use interchangeably, but which represent two warring ways of knowing the world: expertise versus experience. In our modern sociological view, expertise is often seen as a property of elite socialization. It is the result of years of top-down authority, validated by universities, ivory towers, and professional credentials. It is the possession of esoteric knowledge, knowledge that is hidden from the many and reserved for the few. Experience, on the other hand, is increasingly framed as a bottom-up authority. It is a raw, phenomenological encounter with reality. Its legitimacy doesn't come from a degree on a wall. It comes from living through something. It is the authority of the patient over the doctor, the farmer over the bureaucrat, and the citizen over the state. Today, we are going to dissect the anatomy of this knowledge. We will look at how it is acquired, how it is validated, and how we draw the lines, the boundaries, between the expert and the layperson. 1.1. The etymological and historical roots. To understand why we are fighting about this today, we have to look back at where these words came from. Language is the fossil record of our social evolution. The word expertise has a fascinating history. It comes from the Latin root expertus, which simply means to try. In its earliest days, being expert was an adjective. You were a person who had been tried or experienced by life. If you had survived a voyage at sea, you were expert in the sea. The expert and the experienced person were, at that time, the same person. But then a transformation occurred, what sociologists call a third-order transformation. First, the verb, to try, became an adjective, being tried, experienced. Second, the adjective became a person noun, the expert. Third, and most crucially, it became a substance noun, expertise. This linguistic shift changed everything. It turned a quality of a person, their biography and their journey, into a commodity. Something that could be detached from the individual, bottled up, institutionalized, and sold. It allowed for the creation of a class of people who possessed expertise not because they had spent 40 years on a boat, but because they had spent 4 years in a classroom studying the theory of the boat. This sets the stage for our modern conflict. On one side, we have the expert, defined by Peter Deere as someone reckoned to be likely to be experienced by a social group. On the other, we have the authority of experience, the obligate engagement with the sensory reality of the world. It is the map versus the territory, and as we will see, the territory is often much muddier than the map suggests. 2. Theoretical foundations, the tacit dimension. If we want to get serious about the sociology of expertise, we have to ask a difficult question. What is knowledge? If expertise were just a collection of facts, what we call propositional knowledge, then the difference between a world-class virologist and a teenager with a fast internet connection would just be a matter of how many Wikipedia pages they've read. But we know intuitively that this isn't true. The difference is not quantitative, it is qualitative. It is rooted in what Michael Polanyi called tacit knowledge. 2.1. The Polanyian Framework. We know more than we can tell. Michael Polanyi was a physical chemist and philosopher who, in 1958, wrote a book called Personal Knowledge. He observed a fundamental limit to human speech. We know more than we can tell. Think about the act of riding a bicycle. A physicist can write down the differential equations for you. They can explain the gyroscopic effects of the wheels, the centrifugal force in a turn, and the center of gravity. This is know that, explicit propositional knowledge. But you could memorize those equations for 1,000 years and still fall over the moment you got on the seat. The ability to ride is know-how. It is a somatic embodied skill that lives in your muscles and your nervous system. You cannot write it down. You cannot tell it. You can only do it. Polanyi argued that even the highest levels of science are exactly like riding a bike. A scientist doesn't just follow a lab manual like a recipe. They have a connoisseurship of their instruments. They have a feel for the data. They can look at a graph and sense that something is wrong before they can explain why. This is the tacit dimension. 2.2. The socialization of knowledge. This has profound sociological consequences. If expertise is tacit, it cannot be transmitted through books. It can only be acquired through enculturation. To become an expert, you have to join a community of practice. You have to stand next to the master, watch how they move, listen to how they speak, and let them correct you until the rules of the art become subsidiary awareness. You internalize them until you don't have to think about them anymore. This creates a massive barrier to entry. It means an outsider cannot do their own research simply by reading papers. Without the socialization that provides the tacit keys to interpretation, the outsider is effectively illiterate. They see the data, but they don't see the meaning of the data. This is why experts often sound arrogant to the public. When they say, "you wouldn't understand," they aren't always being elitist. They are acknowledging that you lack the tacit framework that only comes from years of socialization. 2.3. Raw experience versus articulated knowledge. But let's flip the script. What about the experience of the layperson? In sociology, we talk about raw experience, the immediate pre-linguistic encounter with the world. Think of a patient living with a rare chronic illness. They have raw experience of their symptoms. It is a shock of reality that hasn't been filtered through a medical textbook yet. This experience is unbiased in the sense that it isn't restricted by professional dogma. But it is raw because it might lack the causal framework to explain why it's happening. The relationship between the expert's knowledge and the layperson's experience should be symbiotic. Experience provides the sensory input that challenges the theory, and theory provides the framework that makes the experience intelligible. But as we know, in the real world, these two forces are often at each other's throats. 3. The periodic table of expertises, the third wave. How do we categorize these different ways of knowing? Harry Collins and Robert Evans, two leaders in the field, developed what they call the periodic table of expertises. This is a map of the different levels of knowing a subject. For the benefit of our listeners, I will break this down into 3 main levels: ubiquitous expertises, specialist expertises, and meta-expertises. 3.1 Ubiquitous expertises. At the top, we have ubiquitous tacit knowledge. This is the knowledge we all have just by being alive in a society. It's the ability to speak our native language. We don't know the formal rules of grammar, but we can spot a mistake instantly. It's the ability to know how far to stand from someone in an elevator. Crucially, Collins and Evans argue that while technical decisions, like how to build a bridge, require specialists, political judgment is a ubiquitous expertise. In a democracy, we don't need a PhD to decide if we want a bridge or where it should go. That is the expertise of the citizen. 3.2. The ladder of specialist knowledge. This is where the conflict usually happens. Let's look at the spoken format of the specialist expertise hierarchy. Beer mat knowledge. This is the most superficial level. It's facts that fit on a coaster. E equals mc squared. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. In the age of Google, we all have infinite beer mat knowledge. But knowing the rule of the bishop in chess doesn't make you a chess player. Mistaking these facts for expertise is the primary source of modern epistemic hubris. Popular understanding. This is what you get from reading National Geographic or watching a high-quality documentary. It presents science as a finished product, settled, clean, and certain. The danger here is that when people see real science, which is messy and uncertain, they think the experts are lying because it doesn't match the popular version they were sold. Primary source knowledge. This is the internet researcher level. You read the actual papers. You have high information, but low tacit understanding. You can see the words, but you can't hear the sarcasm or the scare quotes that insiders use. You might find a rogue study and think it's a breakthrough, not realizing the entire community knows that specific lab has a reputation for bad data. This is the primary source fallacy. Interactional expertise. This is a fascinating level. This is the ability to talk the talk without being able to walk the walk. It's acquired by spending years talking to experts until you can speak their language indistinguishably. Contributory expertise. This is the gold standard. It's the ability to actually do the thing, to perform the surgery, to run the experiment, to contribute new knowledge to the field. It is somatic. It involves the body. 4. The problem of interaction and extension. The gap between interactional and contributory expertise explains how our complex society functions. 4.1. The imitation game. Harry Collins actually proved that interactional expertise exists using something called the imitation game, like a Turing test for humans. Collins, a sociologist, spent years hanging out with gravitational wave physicists. He learned their language, their jokes, and their logic. In a blind test, he was asked technical questions about physics alongside a real physicist. A panel of other physicists couldn't tell who was the fake. He could talk the physics perfectly, even though he couldn't build the laser interferometers himself. This is vital because it's how management works. A manager of a space agency doesn't need to know how to weld the fuel tank, contributory expertise, but they must have the interactional expertise to understand when the welder is telling them something is wrong. 4.2. Referred expertise. We also use what we call referred expertise. This is when you take expertise from one domain and use it to judge another. If you have successfully managed a massive hospital, you have referred expertise in how large systems work, which might help you manage a university. You don't know the content, but you know the form. You know what a crisis looks like, and you know how experts behave when they are lying. 5. Judgment in a democracy. Meta-expertise. If contributory expertise is so rare, how can we have a democracy? Most of us will never understand the math of climate change or the biostatistics of a vaccine. We cannot judge the science, so instead, we judge the scientists. This is meta-expertise. 5.1. Ubiquitous discrimination. We all do this every day. We use our social intelligence, ubiquitous discrimination, to decide who to trust. We look for, does this person seem consistent? Do they have a financial conflict of interest? Do they look and sound like someone who knows what they're talking about? This system is fragile. It relies on social cues, the suit and the lab coat. When a populist leader tells you that those credentials are just marks of the corrupt elite, your system of discrimination breaks down. You are left without a compass. 5.2. Technical connoisseurship. There is also a higher level called technical connoisseurship. Think of an art critic. They can't paint a masterpiece, but they have seen so many paintings that they can spot a forgery or a work of genius instantly. They have experience within the conventions of judgment. This is how we can bridge the gap, by becoming connoisseurs of expertise without having to be experts ourselves. 6. Policing the borders, boundary work. Now we must talk about the politics of these categories. Thomas Guerin, a great sociologist, argues that science isn't just a thing that exists in nature. It is a space that is constantly being defended through boundary work. Experts use three strategies to protect their authority: expulsion, defining who is out. Astronomers expel astrologers. Doctors expel quacks. It's about keeping the brand clean. Expansion, claiming new territory. This is the medicalization of life. Problems that used to be moral or social, like addiction, are brought inside the boundary of medical expertise. Protection, insulating science from politics. Experts try to frame their work as pure and objective so that politicians can't tell them what to do. But these boundaries are not walls, they are battlegrounds. 7. The insurrection of experience, lay expertise. In the late 20th century, the lay people started fighting back. They argued that their experience wasn't just a lack of expertise, it was a different kind of expertise. 7.1 Case Study: The Cumbrian Sheep Farmers. After the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, radioactive rain fell on the hills of Cumbria in England. Government scientists arrived and told the farmers not to worry. The radiation would wash away in a few weeks because that's what their computer models, based on clay soil, said. The farmers disagreed. They knew their land. They knew the soil was peaty and held moisture. They knew how the sheep grazed. The scientists ignored them. And the scientists were wrong. The radiation stayed for years. The farmers had lay expertise, local, specific, and deep, that the universal expertise of the scientists missed. This was a vindication of experience. 7.2 Case Study: AIDS Activism. In the 1980s, AIDS activists did something even more radical. They didn't just protest, they studied. They acquired interactional expertise. They learned the biostatistics. They learned to talk like doctors. Because they could speak the language, they forced their way into the rooms where clinical trials were designed. They used the authority of their own survival to change how drugs were tested. They proved that a layperson could become an expert through sheer labor and the fire of lived experience. 8. The phenomenology of lived experience. Today, we hear the term lived experience everywhere. In sociology, we distinguish between raw and cooked experience. Raw experience is the immediate feeling. Cooked experience is when you've thought about it and turned it into a story or a theory. In social policy, lived experience has become a form of epistemic capital. We believe that someone who has experienced poverty has an ontological authority that a researcher with a spreadsheet does not. But there is a caution here. A patient has absolute authority over how they feel, the phenomenology, but that doesn't mean they have authority over the cause of the feeling, the etiology. If I feel a sharp pain in my arm after a vaccine, I am the world's leading expert on that pain. But I am not necessarily an expert on whether the vaccine caused it. The danger is when we use the authority of experience to make causal claims that require specialist expertise. 9. The crisis of expertise, trans science. Why does this feel like a crisis right now? Sociologist Gil Eyal says it's because of trans science. These are questions that we ask of science, but science cannot answer. Questions like, is this level of risk acceptable? Or, should we lock down our city? These are value judgments. They are political, but we ask experts to answer them. When the experts give an answer, they are stepping out of their contributory expertise and into the realm of values. When the public sees that the science isn't a single perfect answer, they lose trust in everything. Eyal calls this the push-me-pull-you of the modern age. We rely on experts more than ever. We trust the pilot, the GPS, the surgeon. But we distrust expert advice more than ever. We trust the black box of the machine, but we don't trust the speaking subject of the human. 10. Contemporary battlegrounds. We see this most clearly in climate change and vaccination. In the climate debate, skeptics don't just ignore science, they mimic it. They find contrarian experts, people with interactional expertise who look like scientists but aren't doing the work in that specific field. They exploit the gap between popular understanding, which wants certainty, and the research front, which deals in probability. In the vaccine debate, it is a clash between statistical expertise and narrative experience. To a public health expert, a 1 in a million side effect is a success. To the mother of that one child, it is a 100% catastrophe. The experience of the individual trumps the data of the population. 11. Conclusion: restitching the fabric. As we conclude, let us reflect. The sociology of knowledge tells us that the divide between expertise and experience is not a simple choice between truth and ignorance. Both are necessary. Expertise is a deep, tacit capability. It allows us to build the world and save lives. It cannot be replaced by a Google search or common sense. Experience is our grounding in reality. It is the ground truth that keeps the abstract models of the experts honest. The crisis of expertise is really a failure of translation. We need to stop treating the boundary between these two worlds as a wall and start treating it as a trading zone. We need experts who respect the local knowledge of the public, and a public that understands the tacit labor of the expert. Experience tells us what it's like to live in the world. Expertise gives us the tools to keep that world living. Data summary, types of knowledge, and their social function. To summarize the landscape we've covered today, let's look at the different types of knowledge and how they function in our society. Knowledge type: beer mat knowledge. Source: trivia and isolated factoids. Tacit component: none. Social function: casual conversation and social interaction. Danger: it creates the illusion of competence. Knowledge type: primary source knowledge. Source: reading actual research papers. Tacit component: low, because there is no interaction with the community. Social function: allows for independent investigation. Danger: the primary source fallacy or misinterpretation of data. Knowledge type: interactional expertise. Source: linguistic immersion and socialization with practitioners. Tacit component: high linguistic. Social function: vital for management, journalism, and sociology. Danger: it is armchair expertise. The person cannot actually perform the task. Knowledge type: contributory expertise. Source: intense practice, physical training, and community membership. Tacit component: high somatic bodily. Social function: actually doing the science or the work. Danger: it can be very narrow and disconnected from the public's values. Knowledge type: lived experience. Source: phenomenology, the immediate experience of life. Tacit component: high embodied. Social function: providing ground truth and fuel for advocacy. Danger: anecdotal bias and the risk of claiming false causality. Knowledge type: lay expertise. Source: a hybrid of deep personal experience and focused study. Tacit component: mixed. Social function: challenging the orthodoxy, as seen with AIDS activists. Danger: it can be co-opted by pseudoscience if not rigorous. Thank you for your time and attention.